So in my previous article, I showed how to fetch the item level user accesses for the user that exist in the Fabric tenant. So I used a Graph API to fetch a list of all types of security principal, whether it's a user group or a service principal from the Entra account, and then fetch the underlying access across all the entities in the Fabric. All right. The drawback with that approach was that it was not possible to fetch a service principal and the intra-group accesses in the Fabric tenant. So now I'm using a different approach. So in the previous approach, I had used a list access entities API that you see on the screen. So here I was fetching the user ID from the Graph API and sending those individual user IDs against the user ID identifier here. Unfortunately, it does not recognize service principal or a group ID values that is returned from the Graph API. For example, if the Graph API returns a service principal ID of 123 and I set the value in the API that is 123, the API doesn't return anything as it does not recognize the value of 123 as an existing user ID. So this was the biggest flaw in the previous approach. So in new approach, what I've done is that I'm first fetching a list of items that is existing in the workspace using the API that you see on the screen, and then fetching the user that have access to these items using the API list item access details. All right. So this API basically returns a comprehensive details of the user access to that item apart from identifying the type of user. So if you look at the response here, so first let's look at the parameter. So here the API expects a workspace ID and the item ID, and I can fetch the item ID using the list item API and passing those individual item IDs to this API for the item ID identifier. So this is the response from this API. So if you look at this property called as a type equal to group. So basically this property helps us identify if the underlying security principle is a group or a user or a service principle. And if you look at the sample value, so this is the item ID set for this item ID that has been set for this API. So this item ID is of a type notebook, right? And this item has, so this user Jacob Hancock has, which is of a type user, has access to this item with permissions read share and read all view output. And same is the case with this user called as an Eric Solomon, and this user also has this set of permissions, and this is a group now which can be identified by the value of the type property, and this group has these set of accesses or permissions to this item which is of the type notebook. But let's switch back to the code. Okay, so in the code, so I have set the client ID and the CSV location where the details would get exported to, and details of the user accesses, and this is the client ID. And for this client ID, I'll just show the, so I'm using this client ID. I'll show the permissions required. Okay, so basically it requires two sets of permission. One is the tenant read write all and the workspace read write all, and the type should be delegated type. And one more thing I would like to highlight here is that this API has a drawback wherein you can send only 20 to 200 requests per hour. All right, so what I've done is that I have set a delay of 5 seconds in the code. Show that. So there's a delay of 5 seconds in the code for every iterations where the API sensor, where we send a request to the API. So every iterations there will be 5-second delay before the next request gets sent. Okay, so I'll run the code. I should prompt for a browser-based authentication to generate the bearer token. Okay, so here I'll just put a breakpoint here. Okay, so it's fetching the list of workspaces. Then it has started fetching the items under those workspaces. And now it has started to fetching the user the security level access for the item across every item across each workspace. All right, so I've added a breakpoint here, and those details get inserted into a dictionary object. And this dictionary object has in under the key uh, of the dictionary, what I've done is that I've added workspace name, the name of the item and the type of the item, and then in the value I have the underlying security principal name, the type of the security principal name, and the permissions, and along with the additional permissions. So this user is of a type sorry, this service principal is of a type user having this permissions along with this additional permissions. If we go back to the sample response here, so we have the type, the display name, which is same. We have this, sorry, we have the name, the type, the permissions, and the additional permissions. So we have the display name, which is the name, the type, the, the permissions, and the additional permissions. Right, let's execute the code. So now what will happen is that for every execution there will be a 5-second delay across each iteration. Okay, you see this. I mean, this value of 5 seconds works for me. I mean, that can be changed. That should be configured on a case-to-case basis. Right. This added breakpoint here. Okay. Now till now it has processed almost 12. Okay. So here, so it has processed 12 items. So yeah, this is interesting. So we have this type service principal. All right. So this type the security type security uh, principal type is service principal. And let's go back and check the Entra account. Yeah, app registrations. So we have Fabric OR2 and Fabric API service principal. We have Fabric OR2 and Fabric API service principal, and apart from that, we also have group Fabric users group. Okay, let's check that group all groups. Okay, we have this group called as Fabric users. All right, so now what I'm going to do is that I'm going to like pause the recording, because what is happening is that for every iteration is there's going to be a 5-second delay. And once the list object, I mean the dictionary object gets loaded with all the accesses across all the entities, I'll restart the recording. Right. Okay, I'll just pause the recording. All right, so now the execution is completed. So as you can see, now the count is 157. So we have um, I mean the access security access details for 157 items. And yeah, so we have the workspace name, we have the item name and the type of the item, and we have the security principal name, the type of the security principal, with the permissions and the additional permissions. And here is the CSV file. I'll just open that. Okay. Yeah. So as you can see, we have the workspace name, the item type, the username. I mean, this should not be username. It should have been service principal name. Sorry, the security principal name, and the type, that is the security principal type, and the permissions and the additional permission. So I should basically change the column D and E, the column header for D and E. Yeah. All right. So that's all for this walkthrough. Okay. So this can be like changed to fetch. The code can be manipulated to change so that it accepts, so that only the user access for a particular item or only for a particular um, what do you call that workspace can be fetched to the code. So at this moment, I have the code fetches all the details across all the workspaces, right? So this can be like configured to fetch details only for a given workspace or for a given item. All right, so that's all for this walkthrough. If you do have a questions or comments, do let me know. Thank you very much.